Rain pressed flat against the dome of the embassy garden the day the Coordant assembly chose to land. No alarms rang. No officer barked orders. A boy named Owen was simply throwing a ball for his dog when the sky split open with light, and that quiet, ordinary moment became the one history would remember as humanity's first contact. The ship that descended was not built for war. It looked like a slow-turning piece of glass, catching colors that had no names. From it walked a single figure, tall and pale-skinned, with eyes like dark water. He introduced himself as Director Voss, envoy of the Coordant Assembly, a union of star-faring species older than human memory. Beside him floated a small drone that translated his words into perfect, toneless English. Earth's response team was led by a woman named Clara Whitfield, a former field doctor turned diplomat, chosen not because she was the most powerful person in the room, but because she listened well. She greeted Voss with a steady hand and a steadier voice. "Welcome to Earth," she said. "We've been waiting a long time to not be alone." Voss studied her the way a scientist studies an insect that has, against all odds, learned to speak. "Your species is young," he said. "Reckless, violent, and yet, somehow still here." It was not quite an insult. It was not quite a compliment either. Over the following days, Voss toured the planet with clinical detachment. He walked through crowded markets in Lagos, sterile laboratories in Geneva, and quiet fishing villages in the Philippines, recording everything with a small device embedded in his collar. He watched humans argue, laugh, grieve, and forgive each other within the same afternoon, and he found it bewildering. The Assembly's own member species had long ago smoothed such chaos out of themselves. Clara noticed something the data devices could not record: hesitation in him. Once, watching a mother comfort her crying child outside a hospital, Voss stood motionless for nearly a full minute. His translator droned silent, as if some old, buried thing in him understood the gesture better than his species' centuries of evolution had prepared him to admit. By the fourth day, rumors spread through Earth's governments. The Assembly had a reputation. Species evaluated and found incompatible simply stopped appearing in galactic records. No declarations of failure. No explanations. Just silence, and then nothing. Clara raised this directly with Voss during a private meeting in the embassy's garden, the same garden where the boy had been throwing his ball that first morning. "If you find us unworthy," she said, "will you at least tell us why?" Voss did not answer right away. He looked instead toward the gray sky, where his ship still waited, patient and unreadable. "The Assembly does not hate young species," he said finally. "It fears them. Fear makes silence easier than honesty." That answer chilled her more than any threat could have. On the seventh day, Voss requested a final tour, alone, with no escort but Clara herself. He asked to see a hospital, then a school, then, strangely, a small graveyard on the edge of the city, where he stood reading names he could not pronounce, carved into stone by hands that had loved the people beneath them. "Your dead are remembered individually," he said. "Mine are remembered as numbers, sorted by service record." I had not considered which was worse, until now. Clara said nothing. She had learned, during years of treating frightened patients, that silence sometimes did more good than words. That evening, Voss returned to his ship to deliver his preliminary findings to the Assembly Council, a closed session that no human would be permitted to witness. Before boarding, he turned back to Clara one last time. "Whatever judgment comes," he said, "know that I argued honestly." It was the closest thing to warmth she had heard from him in 7 days. The ship lifted off without ceremony, the same quiet, glass-like glide with which it had arrived, and disappeared into the clouds. Clara stood in the garden long after it was gone, the boy and his dog now playing nearby once more, utterly unaware that the fate of their entire species might already be sealed somewhere far beyond the reach of any sky they could see. No message came that night. None came the next day, or the day after. The silence that followed would prove far stranger and far more frightening than anything Voss had said aloud. 3 weeks of silence passed before anyone in Geneva admitted, out loud, that something was wrong. The Assembly's communication relay, a small device left behind in the embassy's control room, blinked steadily but transmitted nothing. No verdict. No further contact. No second ship. Clara Whitfield spent those weeks fielding calls from nervous government officials across a dozen countries, all asking the same question in different words. Had humanity failed its test, or had it simply been forgotten? She had no answer to give them. The not knowing was its own kind of cruelty, worse in some ways than a clear rejection would have been. Rumors filled the gap where facts should have been. A retired general in Brazil claimed the assembly had been destroyed in some distant war and would never return. A physicist in South Korea insisted humanity had been quietly marked as a failed species and quarantined behind some invisible barrier none of Earth's instruments could detect. Late-night television hosts joked about it until the jokes stopped being funny. Clara ignored most of it, focusing instead on keeping the embassy's small staff calm and ready, because some instinct told her that whatever came next, it would come without warning. She was right. On a gray Tuesday morning, without any signal, without the courteous radio call that had preceded the first landing, a shuttle dropped through the clouds and settled onto the same embassy field as before. It was Voss's personal craft. Clara recognized the curved hull instantly, but everything else about its arrival was wrong. There was no escort fleet, no honor guard ships flanking it in formation, the way there had been the first time. No transponder signal reached ground control, which meant the shuttle had crossed into Earth's atmosphere completely undetected until visual contact, something the original assembly briefing had called technically impossible for any of their vessels. Ground crews scrambled into position, uncertain whether to treat this as a diplomatic return or a security breach. The ramp lowered slowly, with a grinding sound that hadn't been there before, as if something inside the mechanism had been damaged and roughly repaired. Clara stood at the front of the small, welcoming party, her heart hammering despite years of training in keeping her composure. Voss stepped out alone. He looked, at first glance, like himself, tall, pale, dressed in the same dark formal robes he had worn before. But his walk was different, stiff and uneven, like a man relearning how his own legs worked. His eyes, once sharp and assessing, now stared somewhere past the people in front of him, as though he were looking through them at something only he could see. Clara stepped forward. "Director Voss, welcome back." Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. He did not answer. He did not even seem to register that she had spoken. He simply walked, slow and deliberate, past the welcoming party, past the cameras that several officials had insisted on setting up, past everyone, toward the embassy building itself, as though pulled by some private gravity none of them could feel. Security officers moved to intercept him, unsure whether this counted as a threat. Clara raised a hand, stopping them. "Let him go," she said quietly. "Just watch him." They followed at a careful distance as Voss walked through the embassy's halls, not toward any meeting room, but toward the garden, the same garden where he had once stood reading names on gravestones. He stopped at the exact spot where he had stood that day, and there he remained, motionless, staring at nothing, for nearly 2 hours. When Clara finally approached him directly, speaking his name gently, he turned his head toward her with a slowness that unsettled her more than any sudden movement could have. His lips parted. For a long moment, no sound came out. Then, finally, in a voice that barely resembled his own, he spoke 3 words that meant nothing to her, words that would haunt every researcher who later heard the recording. The chorus remembers. He said nothing else that night. Medical scans, hastily arranged with whatever equipment the embassy could gather, showed his vital signs were technically stable, yet subtly wrong in ways no human doctor could explain, patterns that didn't match any biological data the assembly had shared with Earth during their brief alliance. Clara sat beside him long after the medical staff left, watching a being who had once judged her entire species now sitting silent and broken in a garden he had visited only once before, clearly searching for something or someone that wasn't there anymore. Whatever had happened to him in those 3 missing weeks, it had not happened on Earth, and it had changed him into something Earth did not yet have the words to understand. The investigation began the next morning, though investigation felt like too clean a word for what was really controlled uncertainty. Clara assembled a small team, a quiet, methodical engineer named Felix Okafor who specialized in reading damaged flight systems, and a xenopsychologist from Mumbai named Priya Anand, whose career had been built studying how minds, human and otherwise, broke and rebuilt themselves after trauma. Their first task was the shuttle itself, now sitting in a sealed hangar outside the embassy grounds. Felix spent 2 full days inside it before he called Clara in, his expression tight with the particular discomfort of an engineer who has found something his training cannot explain. "The ship's logs have a gap," he said, pulling up a wall of data on a portable screen. 6 weeks. The assembly briefing said Voss left here, then returned roughly 3 weeks later, our time. But according to the ship's own internal clock, it experienced 6 weeks of flight during that period. The numbers don't match. Clara frowned. Could the clock be malfunctioning? That's what I thought too, Felix said. Except every other system aligns with the missing time. Fuel consumption, hull stress patterns, life support cycling. The ship behaved as if 6 weeks passed, even though only 3 did, here on Earth. He pulled up a star chart next, one borrowed quietly from assembly records Voss had shared in friendlier days. A region of space was marked near the edge of mapped territory, far beyond any trade route, labeled only with a small warning glyph and no name. The shuttle's last confirmed position before the gap puts it heading directly toward this region. Nothing here has ever been formally explored, at least not by anyone who came back to talk about it. While Felix worked through the technical wreckage, Priya spent her time with Voss himself, in slow, careful sessions in the garden, since moving him elsewhere seemed only to deepen his distress. She used no aggressive questioning, no demands. She simply sat near him, sometimes in silence for hours, occasionally offering small, gentle prompts the way she might with a trauma survivor who had lost the ability to trust language. On the 3rd day, Voss spoke again, this time in fuller sentences, though they made little sense to anyone listening. He spoke of the deep current and what waits beneath the old stars, phrases that meant nothing to human ears, but which he repeated with the flat, exhausted certainty of someone describing something he had personally touched. Priya recorded every word carefully, cross-referencing them later against what little assembly philosophy and mythology Earth's diplomats had managed to gather during the brief alliance. Nothing matched. Whatever Voss was describing did not appear in any official assembly record Earth had access to, which only deepened the unease in the room. By the end of the week, Felix and Priya brought their findings together. The picture that emerged was unsettling in its simplicity. Voss's shuttle had been pulled, deliberately or by accident, into an unmapped, unnamed region of space the assembly itself seemed to avoid. Something there had altered the ship's internal sense of time, damaged its systems in ways too consistent to be random failure, and changed Voss himself, both physically and mentally, in ways neither human science nor what little assembly science Earth understood could explain. Most troubling of all was a single recurring data pattern buried deep in the shuttle's damaged sensor logs, a waveform that repeated with eerie regularity throughout the entire missing 6 weeks, neither random noise nor any known form of communication. Felix played a short audio translation of it for Clara late one evening, a low, pulsing hum that rose and fell like something breathing. "It's not a malfunction," he said quietly. "Whatever recorded this, the ship picked it up from outside itself. Something out there was transmitting. Or maybe," he hesitated, "something was just there, existing, and the ship happened to be close enough to notice." Clara stared at the waveform on the screen, then glanced through the window toward the garden, where Voss sat motionless once again, watching the sky as though waiting for that same sound to return. Whatever had touched him out there, it had not finished with him yet. Voss's recovery, if it could be called that, came slowly and unevenly over the following 2 weeks. Some mornings he spoke almost normally, asking quiet questions about Earth's weather or its strange habit of burying its dead with flowers. Other mornings he said nothing at all, sitting in the garden with the same hollow stare that had marked his return, as though some part of him were still drifting through that unmapped region of space, unable to fully come home. Priya's patience finally began to pay off. She had learned, through years of treating trauma in human patients, that forcing memory rarely worked, but creating safety sometimes allowed memory to surface on its own. She stopped asking direct questions about what happened and instead simply kept him company, let him set the pace, and waited. It was on a quiet afternoon, with rain falling softly against the garden's glass dome, that Voss finally spoke clearly about what he remembered. "The ship lost its course," he said, his voice steadier than it had been in days. Not from damage. From invitation. I felt it before any instrument detected it. A pulling, like a tide beneath the stars, calling the ship somewhere the charts refused to name. Priya said nothing, letting him continue at his own speed. My escort followed the pull as I did, he said. 4 ships. 12 of my own people, sworn to the assembly long before I was born. We entered a region with no light, no stars, only a kind of pressure, as if space itself remembered something painful and didn't want to be touched. His hands trembled slightly as he continued. We were not destroyed. I want that understood clearly. We were unmade, reshaped. I watched my honor guard's ships stop being ships. Their hulls did not break. They simply became something else, something that no longer needed a name, folded into whatever intelligence lived in that dark. I felt their minds at the edge of mine in that moment, not screaming, not afraid. Simply absorbed, made part of something larger. Priya kept her voice gentle. And you weren't taken the same way. No, Voss said, and for the first time since his return, something like real grief crossed his face. I was returned. Deliberately. I do not know why I was spared and they were not. I have asked myself that question every hour since. He described, haltingly, a presence rather than a being, vast and patient, that communicated not in words but in pressure and rhythm, the same pulsing waveform Felix had found buried in the ship's damaged logs. He called it, in his own language, something Priya's translation software rendered imperfectly as the chorus, an intelligence that seemed to exist not in any single place, but spread thin across that entire dark region of space, gathering, observing, and occasionally reaching out. It studied me, Voss said. The way I once studied your species. I understood, in that moment, exactly how small and fragile we must have looked to it, the same way you must have looked to me, that first day in your garden. He looked at Priya directly now, something raw and honest in his expression. I am ashamed of how I judged your people. I had no right. Compared to what waits out there, none of us, your species or mine, are as far apart as I once believed. When Clara was told of this conversation later that evening, she sat quietly for a long while before speaking. If something out there is powerful enough to erase an Assembly War envoy's entire honor guard without effort, she said finally, and the Assembly has known about this region long enough to mark it on their charts without daring to name it, then this isn't just Voss's tragedy anymore. It's everyone's problem, ours included, whether we're ready for it or not. Felix, standing nearby, nodded grimly, and it let him go, deliberately, like he said. That's the part that scares me most. Whatever this thing is, it doesn't take. It chooses. Outside, in the rain-soft garden, Voss sat alone again, but for the first time since his return, his eyes were not empty. They were afraid, clearly and humanly afraid, in a way that somehow made him easier for everyone around him to understand. News of Voss's account reached the Assembly Council within days, carried not by Voss himself, who remained too unsteady for formal testimony, but by a careful, detailed report Clara helped him compose, word by patient word, over several long evenings. The council's response came faster than anyone expected, and far more anxious than the calm, measured tone Earth had come to associate with Assembly leadership. A delegation arrived within the week, smaller and far less ceremonial than the first landing had been. No honor guard, no grand ship gliding gracefully through the clouds. Just a single official transport carrying 3 senior counselors, each visibly shaken by what Voss's report implied. It seemed the dark, unnamed region had claimed Assembly ships before, quietly, over centuries, each loss dismissed afterward as an unfortunate accident, a navigational error, bad luck. No one had ever returned to contradict that explanation. Until now. The counselors requested a private session with Earth's leadership, expecting, perhaps, panic or demands for protection, or a quiet request to be left out of whatever followed. What they found instead surprised them. Clara stood before the delegation, flanked by Felix, Priya, and a dozen of Earth's most senior scientists and military strategists, all of whom had spent the past several days not in fear, but in methodical preparation. Charts covered the walls. Proposed safety protocols, recovery procedures, and communication safeguards filled binder after binder. It was not the response of a species waiting to be told what to do. We're not asking you to protect us from this, Clara said. We're asking to help solve it, together, the same way the director described it, choosing to study him instead of destroying him outright. Something out there is curious. Curiosity can be approached carefully. Fear alone has clearly not solved anything for your people in all the centuries you've avoided that region. The senior counselor, a tall, silver-skinned figure named Director Sale, studied her with open skepticism. Your species has touched space for less than a century. You propose approaching something that erased 12 trained envoys without effort, as though it were a simple diplomatic matter. Not simple, Clara said. Careful. Voss survived. Deliberately, according to his own account. That tells us something important. It isn't simply destructive. It chooses. Maybe it's waiting for someone to actually answer instead of running. Voss himself, present for the first time at an official meeting since his return, spoke quietly from where he sat. She is right, Director Sale. I felt no malice in it. Only patience, and perhaps loneliness, on a scale neither of our species has ever had to imagine. His voice, though still fragile, carried a new conviction. I wish to return, not as a sacrifice, but as someone who finally understands enough to ask better questions. The room fell silent. The proposal that followed, built jointly over the following days by both Earth scientists and the Assembly's reluctant but increasingly intrigued specialists, called for a small, carefully equipped expedition, human and Assembly crew together, fitted with new safeguards based on everything Felix and Priya had learned from analyzing Voss's shuttle, prepared not to conquer or contain whatever waited in that region, but simply, finally, to listen. Director Sale remained doubtful until the final vote, but even she could not deny the simple, stubborn resolve radiating from the humans in that room, the same resolve that had first made Voss reconsider his judgment of their species. In the end, the council agreed, reluctantly, to the joint mission, citing Voss's own testimony as the deciding factor. As the meeting closed, Clara found Voss alone again near the garden's edge, the rain finally clearing outside, pale sunlight breaking weakly through the clouds. You didn't have to volunteer, she said. Yes, he said quietly. I did. 12 of my people are out there still, in whatever form that place has made of them. I owe them more than fear. He looked at her, something like gratitude in his tired eyes. And I owe your species an honest evaluation, the kind I should have given from the very beginning. Clara allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, a small, tired smile. Then let's go answer it properly. Preparation for the expedition took nearly 2 months, though to those involved it felt far shorter. Every day consumed by careful planning, system testing, and long debates over how to approach something that had no precedent in either species' history. The ship chosen for the journey was modest by Assembly standards, small enough to move quickly, equipped with redundant systems Felix had personally overseen, and fitted with recording equipment far more advanced than anything aboard Voss's original shuttle. The crew that finally assembled was small and deliberately mixed. Clara insisted on joining herself, despite objections from Earth's government, arguing that someone needed to represent humanity's voice directly rather than secondhand. Priya came as well, her expertise in understanding minds, human and otherwise, considered essential for whatever communication might be possible. Felix monitored the ship's systems personally, refusing to trust the mission's safety to anyone less familiar with its quirks. And Voss, scarred but steady now, walked aboard not as Earth's evaluator, but as something closer to a partner, his pale eyes calm in a way they hadn't been since his return. The crew that rounded out the mission included 2 Assembly specialists, a quiet communications expert and a cautious physicist, both visibly nervous but committed, chosen by Director Sale herself as a gesture of the Council's reluctant trust. On the morning of departure, the embassy garden, the same quiet space where so much had unfolded since Voss's first arrival, held a small, simple gathering. No grand speeches, no cameras, just the crew, a handful of close colleagues, and the boy named Owen, now slightly older, still walking his dog nearby, utterly unaware that the small ship lifting off in the distance carried with it the cautious hope of 2 entire civilizations. As the ship climbed beyond Earth's atmosphere, Clara stood at the viewport beside Voss, watching the planet shrink slowly behind them. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he admitted, "but less than before. Fear alone taught my people nothing in all the centuries they avoided that place. Perhaps understanding will teach us more. The journey to the unnamed region, now informally called the Hollow by the crew, took several weeks. As they approached its edge, every system aboard began behaving strangely, exactly as Felix had predicted based on Voss's original shuttle data. Clocks drifted subtly out of sync. Sensors returned readings that didn't quite match physical reality. And then, faintly at first, growing steadily clearer, the familiar waveform began pulsing softly across their instruments, the same low, breathing rhythm Felix had isolated months earlier. It did not feel threatening. It felt, strangely, like recognition. Priya watched the pattern with quiet fascination. "It's not random," she said softly. "It's responding to our approach. Almost like it's been waiting." Voss stepped closer to the viewport, his expression calm despite the obvious tension in the room. "Then let us not disappoint it," he said. "Let us finally answer." The ship continued forward, deeper into the dark, unmapped silence of the hollow, the pulsing rhythm growing steadily stronger around them, patient, deliberate, and undeniably aware. Behind them, Earth carried on with its ordinary mornings and ordinary lives, unaware that the quiet, careful courage of a handful of people, human and otherwise, was about to make first true contact with something far older and far larger than either species had ever imagined facing. Whatever waited in that darkness, it had chosen, once, to send someone home rather than destroy him completely. Now, it would learn exactly what kind of answer humanity, and the allies it had earned through patience rather than fear, intended to give in return. The story, much like the silence that had once surrounded Voss's strange return, ended not with resolution, but with the quiet, steady promise of something far greater still waiting to unfold.